The bells of the Córdoba Cathedral echoed in the distance as Valentina Montoya walked barefoot across the cobblestone streets of the city's poorest neighborhood. Her feet bled slightly, leaving tiny red marks on the grey earth. She carried a basket of wet laundry pressed against her thin chest, her dress torn in several places, her hands rough and reddened from endless work. At 22 years old, Valentina appeared to be twice that age, as if each day of rejection had carved a line into her face, robbing her of the youth she had never experienced. Her mother, Rosario Montoya, had been a bitter woman for as long as Valentina could remember. A widow since Valentina was 3 years old, she blamed her daughter for her husband's death, as if the child bore responsibility for a man being crushed in the mines. That resentment grew over the years, transforming into silent hatred that permeated every moment of their lives together. Valentina's brothers, Roberto and Miguel, simply followed their mother's example. It was easier to despise their sister than to face their own miseries. When Valentina returned to the small adobe house where her family lived, she found the door wide open. Her heart raced. Something was terribly wrong. Inside, she saw her mother seated on an old chair, arms crossed over her thin chest, her dark eyes staring into nothingness. Her 2 brothers were packing their meager possessions into cloth sacks. A wooden cart waited outside. "We're leaving," announced Rosario without even glancing at her daughter. "A cousin in Madrid promised work in the textile factories, for the boys, for your older brother." She paused, and when she finally looked at Valentina, her eyes were as empty as a tomb without flowers. "You will stay here." Valentina's world stopped. "What?" she whispered, unable to fully comprehend. "What do you mean I stay here? When will you return?" "We're not coming back," said Rosario, rising slowly. "You're already grown, 22 years old. You can work, you can earn your bread. We are not responsible for you." Then, with a gesture of contempt that Valentina would never forget, her mother turned to her sons. "Come, the cart is ready." Valentina looked at her brothers, hoping one of them would say something, would protest, would ask to take her with them. But the silence was deafening. Roberto didn't even lift his gaze. Miguel coughed, uncomfortable, but turned and continued packing. Their silence was worse than any insult. With slow, mechanical movements, her family left the house. Valentina remained standing at the threshold, watching the cart disappear down the dusty road. The dust rose behind them, gradually obscuring their figures, until only silence and the hot Córdoba wind remained. Valentina did not cry. Her tears had dried up years ago. What remained in her chest was a void so deep that she doubted anything could fill it again. In the small house, she found hard bread and a piece of cheese beneath a stone in the kitchen. It was all her mother had left her. Valentina took it and sat on the earthen floor, staring at the bare walls that had been her home. She knew she couldn't stay there much longer. Without money, without family, without anyone to support her, she had only one future: the street or death. 3 days later, Valentina saw a notice posted on the door of the church of San Geronimo. Her hungry eyes read every word as if it were a lifeline. "Wanted, governess for the mansion of the Duke of Córdoba, experience with children necessary. Residence provided." Those words made her feel for the first time that she might live another day. The mansion of Duke Alejandro of Córdoba was a palace of white marble and golden columns that rose like a cathedral over the 7 hills surrounding the city. When Valentina arrived at the wrought iron gates, she almost fainted. A place so magnificent, so clearly alien to someone like her, seemed a divine punishment that the notice had been posted there in the first place. A middle-aged woman, severe in manner, with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, received her. It was Doña Celeste, the head housekeeper. Her eyes scanned Valentina from top to bottom, evaluating, condemning. "Your name?" she asked curtly. "Valentina Montoya, ma'am. Do you have references? Letters from previous employers?" Valentina was honest. She had nothing except the truth. She described the families she had occasionally worked for, the children she had cared for. She spoke of her dedication, her work capacity, her willingness to learn. There was something in her voice, some desperate sincerity that resonated with Doña Celeste. "Come," said the housekeeper. "You will meet Isabella." The girl was sitting on a sofa in a light-filled room, her small body rigid, her lips in a permanent pout. She was 7 years old, with raven-black hair and the greenest eyes Valentina had ever seen. There was something broken in that gaze, something that spoke of pain no child should know. "Isabella, this is Valentina. She will be your new governess," announced Doña Celeste. The girl did not respond. She simply looked away as if Valentina were invisible. Valentina knelt slowly, placing herself at eye level with Isabella. "I've heard you are the most beautiful girl in all of Spain," she began softly. "So beautiful that the king himself asked to meet you." Isabella blinked. A small glimmer of something appeared in her eyes. "That's a lie," said the girl, her voice small but defiant. "Perhaps," smiled Valentina, "but it's the kind of lie that makes life more interesting, don't you think?" For the first time, Isabella smiled. It was small, barely a movement of her lips, but it was enough. Valentina was hired in that same moment. Over the following months, Valentina transformed Isabella's life. She took the girl to the garden, taught her the names of flowers, read her stories beneath an ancient tree. Isabella flourished under that genuine attention, rediscovering the joy she had lost when her mother died 2 years ago. It was during a warm rain that Valentina met Duke Alejandro of Córdoba. Isabella insisted on showing her father a drawing she had made. When they entered the Duke's darkened study, Valentina saw a man who appeared half dead. He was 35 years old, but his green eyes carried the weight of a century. Grief wrapped around him like a shroud. Empty wine bottles covered his desk. "Father, look at what I made," said Isabella cheerfully, running toward him. Alejandro looked at his daughter's drawing. Something in his face moved, a spasm of emotion he hadn't felt in years. "It's beautiful, little one," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. It was then that his eyes found Valentina. In that moment, both recognized something in the other. The weight of abandonment, the scar of rejection, the loneliness of those left behind. For a second, it was as if they were alone in the world, two broken souls meeting in darkness. "And who is this young woman?" asked Alejandro, his voice softer now. "This is Valentina," answered Isabella. "She is the best governess in the world. She knows stories and songs and makes us happy." Valentina knew the protocol. She should have spoken less, should have remained in the shadows. But something in her could not remain silent. "Valentina Montoya, Duke," she said, "it is an honor to serve your family." "Do you have a family, Valentina Montoya?" asked Alejandro, his interest clearly genuine. "I did, sir. They left me recently." The Duke nodded slowly, as if he understood perfectly what that meant. "Then perhaps you and Isabella have something in common. Both know what it is to be abandoned." That night, for the first time in 2 years, Alejandro slept without wine in his system. For the first time in months, Isabella slept without nightmares. The months that followed wove a magic that no one in the mansion had anticipated. Valentina became the beating heart of that house. Wherever she went, joy followed. Isabella was no longer a somber, withdrawn child. She was radiant, curious, alive. And gradually, inevitably, the Duke began to change as well. Alejandro began to appear in the moments shared between Valentina and Isabella. First, he would only peer through the garden door, watching from afar. Then he moved closer. Finally, he joined them beneath the fig tree, listening as Valentina told stories of brave princesses and honorable knights, adapting old Spanish legends to resonate with his daughter's heart. One particular evening, when the sky was painted orange and gold, Valentina stood alone on the upper terrace, arranging wildflowers in a vase. The Duke appeared, holding a steaming cup of tea. "For you," he said, "you work without rest. I thought you might need this." When Valentina took the cup, her fingers brushed his. It was the briefest contact, barely a second, but she felt as if lightning had struck her. Her eyes met his. "Thank you, Alejandro," she whispered, using his name for the first time without the title of Sir. "Only when we are alone," he reminded her, his voice deep and soft as honey. "Here, I can be just a man, not a duke, not an empty shell of pain." Valentina looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the goodness in his green eyes, the loneliness he still carried, but also something new, hope. "Pain is not weakness, Alejandro," she said quietly. "It is simply the way our hearts learn that someone has left a space in us that cannot be filled. That is not escape. That is love." Alejandro stood motionless, watching this young woman who had entered his life like a spring breeze in the winter of his existence. "How can someone so young be so wise?" he asked. "Because everyone who lives knows rejection," replied Valentina, turning to face him fully. "Some are rejected by circumstances, others by fate, and still others," she paused, "are rejected by the people who should love them forever. But Alejandro, Isabella is not rejected, and neither do you need to be." In that moment, with the sun casting golden light upon them both, something changed between them. It was not a moment of dramatic, unbridled passion. It was something deeper, the mutual recognition of two souls who had saved each other. The weeks that followed were of slow and beautiful transformation. Alejandro set down the wine. He spent time with Isabella during the day, laughing genuinely for the first time since his wife's death. And with Valentina, there were stolen moments, conversations in the garden at dusk, gazes that lingered too long, hands touching accidentally when both reached for something at the same time. Then one day a letter arrived. The letter arrived on a cold morning in October, carried by a courier on horseback who left it in the hands of Doña Celeste. The envelope was worn, bearing the marks of travel, and when Valentina opened it with trembling fingers, her heart sank at the familiar handwriting. It was from her mother, Rosario Montoya, and the words that followed would test every ounce of strength and wisdom that Valentina had cultivated in her year and a half at the mansion. The letter read, "Valentina, your brothers and I have gone to Madrid with great hopes. We were promised work in the textile factories, opportunity to finally lift ourselves from poverty. But Madrid is cruel, daughter. The factories closed unexpectedly. Your brothers lost everything in a bad investment scheme. We live in a single room, barely enough to eat. Your mother is ill. We need you. We need money. You must send us everything you earn. It is your duty as a daughter to save your family from ruin. We will come to Córdoba if you do not help us. Come back to us or send money. Do not abandon us, as we would never abandon you." The last sentence stung like a whip. Never abandon you. As if their abandonment had never happened, as if leaving her alone in that small house with only stale bread and rotten cheese was not abandonment, as if their journey to Madrid without her had been something other than complete rejection. Valentina's hands shook as she read the words again and again, searching for a single word of remorse, one gesture of acknowledgement of the pain they had caused her. There was nothing, only demands, only guilt. Only the weight of obligation, wrapped in the language of family duty. When Alejandro found her in the garden that evening, Valentina was sitting beneath the fig tree, the letter crumpled in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of anger. She had cried enough for her family's rejection. These tears were different. They were tears of rage at their audacity, at their attempt to chain her to a past that had nearly destroyed her. "What has happened?" asked Alejandro gently, sitting beside her. He had learned not to demand explanations, but to offer his presence, his willingness to listen. This was how they communicated now, with understanding that needed no words. Valentina handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his face as he read it, saw his expression shift from confusion to comprehension to a controlled anger that seemed to vibrate through his body. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and looked at Valentina with such tenderness that she felt her rage beginning to transform into something else. Not weakness, but clarity. "What do you want to do?" he asked simply. Valentina looked at the letter, at the manipulation woven into every sentence, at the desperation that underlay the demands, and she realized something profound. She had no obligation to this family that had never truly been family to her. Blood did not automatically create bonds. Love did. Choice did. Presence did. Sacrifice did. Her mother had sacrificed nothing for her. Her brothers had offered nothing but indifference. Yet now they expected her to sacrifice her newfound peace, her happiness, her new life for them. "I want to help them," Valentina said finally, "but not in the way they are asking. Not by returning to servitude, not by allowing them to drain me as they have already done." Alejandro listened as she explained her plan. She would write to her mother, offering to help, but on terms that would not destroy her own peace. She would send money for their basic needs, for food and medicine for her mother, but she would not send everything she earned. She would not return to Cordoba to live under their roof. She would not rebuild the chains of obligation that had bound her for so long. But Alejandro had his own plan, one born from a love so fierce that it took Valentina's breath away when he explained it. "I will hire your brothers," he said. "They will work here, in Cordoba, in the estate's management and the neighboring properties. I will pay them fair wages. They can lodge in the village. Your mother can come as well, and we will provide her with a room and care for her illness. But they will work for this assistance. They will earn their bread, not take it from your back." "Why would you do this?" whispered Valentina, tears flowing freely now. "They are nothing to you. They are your family," he said simply. "And I love you. Which means I will help them, not for them, but for you, so that you need never wonder if you abandon them, so that you can help them without destroying yourself in the process." 2 weeks later, Rosario, Roberto, and Miguel Montoya arrived in Cordoba on a hired coach, their possessions reduced to what could fit in 2 traveling trunks. Valentina waited at the gates of the mansion, her heart thundering in her chest. She had not seen her family in almost 2 years. She had convinced herself that she did not care, that they had died to her when they left her in that small adobe house. But standing there, watching them descend from the coach, she realized that love and pain were not always opposing forces. Sometimes they existed in the same space, the way light and shadow occupied the same room at dusk. Rosario was thinner than Valentina remembered, her face aged by hardship, her eyes carrying the weight of hunger and fear. She saw her daughter and stopped dead. For a long moment neither woman moved. Then Rosario began to weep, not the dignified tears of polite sorrow, but the desperate sobs of someone who had finally understood the magnitude of her mistakes. "Valentina," breathed her mother, and in that single word there was an apology more profound than any letter could contain. "Forgive me. Please, forgive me." Valentina did not run into her mother's arms. She did not forget the pain. But she walked toward her with an open heart, and when she embraced the woman who had given her life while seeming to wish her away, she chose forgiveness, not because her mother deserved it, but because Valentina deserved the freedom that forgiveness would grant her. The introduction process was careful and deliberate. Alejandro met with each family member separately, explaining what he was offering and what he expected in return. To Roberto and Miguel, he laid out positions of authority and responsibility, opportunities to earn honest wages and rebuild their lives with dignity. To Rosario, he offered something more precious than money, the opportunity to repair the relationship with her daughter. "Your daughter has a pure heart," Alejandro told Rosario during their meeting in his study. "She was abandoned by the people who should have protected her most fiercely, and yet she has chosen to offer you kindness instead of bitterness." Do not mistake this kindness for weakness or acceptance of what you have done. This is strength. This is love in its truest form. If you are wise, you will spend the rest of your life trying to deserve the generosity she is showing you. Rosario wept throughout this conversation, and when she emerged, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted within her. In the days that followed, she spent her time not making demands, but attempting, clumsily, imperfectly, to repair what she had broken. Roberto and Miguel began their work in the estate. They were not treated as servants, but as employees, as men working to earn their position. The work was demanding but fair, and gradually they began to understand that their sister had found something they had not, a place where she was valued, where her efforts were recognized, where her presence mattered deeply to someone of substance and character. The transformation that occurred over the following months was subtle but profound. Rosario's health improved under the care of a physician and with access to regular meals. Her eyes began to lose some of the hardness that had characterized them. She started to cook meals in the mansion's kitchen, working alongside the cook, and in that act, in the creation of something nourishing for her daughter, she began her true redemption. Roberto and Miguel proved to be capable workers. They learned the management of the estate, the maintenance of the properties, the complexities of running a large household. More importantly, they began to see their sister in a new context. She was not the weak, rejected, pitiful girl they had left behind in poverty. She was a woman of strength and dignity, respected by all who knew her, beloved by one of the most powerful men in Córdoba, trusted with the care and education of a young girl. The respect they felt for her transformed into a genuine, hard-won, brotherly affection. Valentina, for her part, established boundaries that would have seemed unthinkable to her younger self. She spent time with her family, but not all her time. She was kind to them, but not at the expense of her own peace. She helped them, but not by sacrificing what she had built. This balance, this refusal to swing from one extreme of rejection to another extreme of total acceptance, was the true mark of her growth. And then came the day when everything crystallized into its final form. It was a warm evening in May, 4 months after her family had arrived in Córdoba. Valentina sat in the garden with Alejandro and Isabella, reading to them under the stars. Rosario approached, and for a moment, Valentina tensed, waiting for some new demand or crisis. But Rosario simply sat down on the bench nearby, and with Valentina's permission, listened to the story. When the reading was finished, and Isabella had been taken inside by a nurse, Rosario remained. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about what the Duke said to me, about deserving generosity. I have decided that I will spend the rest of my days trying to do so, though I fear it will never be enough." Valentina looked at her mother, and for the first time she saw her not as a figure of pain and rejection, but as a flawed human being who had done terribly wrong, but was attempting, however imperfectly, to make amends. "It is enough," Valentina said, and she meant it. "To acknowledge what you have done and to try, that is enough." Alejandro reached over and took Valentina's hand, and in that gesture she felt the full weight of his love, his acceptance of her complicated family, his willingness to see the humanity in all of them. This was what true love looked like, she realized. It was not the passionate declarations she had read about in novels. It was the daily choice to stand beside someone, to support their journey toward healing, to believe in their capacity for forgiveness, even when the world seemed determined to teach them bitterness. When Alejandro proposed to Valentina 2 weeks later, it was not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He simply took her hand one evening in the garden and asked if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. And when Valentina said yes, it was not with the breathless excitement of a young girl swept away by romance. It was with the calm certainty of a woman who had found not just love, but home, not just passion, but partnership, not just beauty, but belonging. The wedding took place in the Córdoba Cathedral on a June morning, with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and illuminating the stone floors. Isabella walked before Valentina, wearing a dress of white lace and wildflowers in her dark hair. Roberto and Miguel stood as witnesses, and Rosario, tears streaming down her face, watched her daughter walk toward a future that none of them could have imagined. Valentina wore a simple dress of pale cream, nothing as elaborate as a duchess might wear, but perfect in its quiet elegance. When she reached the altar and Alejandro took her hands, she saw reflected in his eyes the girl she had been, abandoned and alone on the streets of Córdoba, and the woman she had become. She saw his recognition of her pain and his unwavering love, despite it. She saw their shared future unfold in the depths of that green gaze. The vows they exchanged were traditional, spoken in the language of the church, but Valentina spoke an additional promise under her breath, one that only Alejandro heard. "I will never abandon you. I will never leave you alone in the dark." And she felt his hands tighten around hers as he whispered his own promise. "I will never let you feel abandoned again. You are home, Valentina. You have always been home." In the years that followed, Valentina and Alejandro built a life together that was rooted not in fantasy or perfection, but in the deep, abiding foundation of genuine love. They had children, 2 daughters and a son, and Valentina raised them with the knowledge that family was not merely an accident of blood. It was a choice made daily, a commitment renewed in moments of tenderness and understanding. Rosario became a different woman in those years. She never fully erased the damage of her earlier cruelty, but she worked tirelessly to become the mother and grandmother that she should have been from the beginning. She spent hours with her grandchildren, telling them stories, teaching them to cook, and always emphasizing the value of kindness and the gravity of rejection. Roberto and Miguel established themselves as trusted members of the estate's management. They married women from the village, had families of their own, and eventually they became not just Valentina's brothers in blood, but her true brothers in spirit. They would speak sometimes of the moment they had left her behind in that small house, and each time they would apologize again, each time more deeply than before, until finally Valentina had to tell them that she had forgiven them long ago, that dwelling on that moment only prevented them from living fully in the present. The mansion in Córdoba became known throughout the region as a place of warmth and welcome. Alejandro transformed from a man half dead with grief into a living embodiment of joy. Isabella grew into a remarkable young woman, educated and confident, bearing no scars from the loneliness of her childhood, because Valentina had healed those wounds before they could calcify into her very being. And Valentina, the girl who had been rejected and abandoned, became the heart around which an entire household, an entire family, an entire community revolved. She was the one who remembered everyone's sorrows and celebrated everyone's joys. She was the one who offered comfort to those who suffered and assistance to those in need. She was the living proof that rejection does not define us, that love, true and steadfast, can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone we touch. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the household had settled into peaceful silence, Valentina would sit with Alejandro on the terrace, looking out over the gardens of the mansion. Gardens that had once seemed so distant and impossible, so clearly not for someone like her, and she would think about the letter that had come from Madrid, the demand that she return to servitude, the guilt that had tried to chain her to her past. And she would realize that she had made the right choice, not the choice her mother had demanded, not the choice that would have bound her to a life of endless sacrifice and thankless service, but the choice to forge her own path, to accept help from someone who loved her unconditionally, to establish boundaries that honored both herself and those around her, and to extend grace to those who had hurt her, not because they deserved it, but because she deserved the freedom that forgiveness offered. This was the true triumph of her love for Alejandro and his love for her. It was not a love that erased their pasts or magically healed all wounds. It was a love that created space for healing to occur. It was a love that said, "I see your pain, and I do not run from it. I stand beside it with you." It was a love that was strong enough to include others in its circle, to offer kindness even to those who had caused harm, to believe in redemption and transformation. The rejected girl who had walked the streets of Córdoba barefoot and bleeding had found not just a home, but a family. Not just a love, but a purpose. Not just an escape from her pain, but a way to transform that pain into something meaningful, something that would ripple through generations, something that would teach her children and her grandchildren, and all who came after that. The greatest magic in this world was not found in fairy tales or distant dreams. It was found in the moment when someone looks at you, truly sees you, all your brokenness and pain, and chooses you anyway. It was found in the daily commitment to love despite difficulty. It was found in the courage to forgive those who had hurt you. And most of all, it was found in the profound understanding that we are all broken in some way, and that our shared brokenness is what binds us to one another, what makes us capable of true compassion, what transforms us from isolated individuals into a real, genuine, deeply connected community of love.